Right, so Rachel Reeves, Starmer's Chancellor, is about to screw up the housing mix of this country even more than it already has been by the Tories. And she's going to take us all for fools by implying what she's going to do is all about making housing more affordable. We need more social housing, not less. Yet less is exactly what she's going for, as she seeks to functionally wipe out the notion of social housing by, over the next 10 years, raising the rents of those living in them to more in line of the higher rate of so-called affordable homes, which are themselves all too often unaffordable. And her reason for doing that is so that she can build more affordable homes. Housebuilding off the back of some of the poorest people to build housing they might not be able to afford by pricing them out of the housing they can afford, all to avoid taxing the rich to pay for it, which I suppose she'll still claim she can't see the point of. Rachel Reeves is an economic idiot who appears to get off on picking on the poor. She'll be tougher than the Tories on benefits, she once said. Well, she's making good on that and making these people pay to build more housing. Right, so I can't quite get over the sheer combined cruelty and stupidity of Rachel Reeves this morning, as the Financial Times have broken the story overnight of some of Rachel Reeves' plans on housing, and the standout one is that over the next 10 years, instead of building more social housing, more housing that is genuinely affordable and not affordable in the same sense as so-called affordable housing, which often isn't, it's usually just a fraction below market rate, Reeves is instead going to wipe social housing out, in effect, by hiking the rents on social housing above inflation, essentially working to more closely level up the rent of social housing to the point it ends up, albeit we're yet to see the precise figures to confirm this, but it seems reasonable to conclude that they would end up almost, albeit classed as affordable themselves. Rachel Reeves is effectively going to make more housing unaffordable so that she can build more homes that will also be unaffordable, and yet she's going to call them affordable housing. Yeah. If you take this story and combine it with Keir Starmer blocking Sadiq Khan from introducing rent caps in London, it seems clear that Starmer's Labour are kissing landlord backside big time here with these policies. Because who do you think will have the money to buy the affordable homes or rent them if not on the open market? Are wages going to go up above inflation as well so people can actually afford these so-called affordable homes? I doubt it very much. This is just heaping cruelty on those not just on benefits but lowest earners too. So many people cannot get on the housing ladder themselves because they simply don't earn enough. They don't have enough money coming in. So many people are screwed over by rents that take too big a chunk of their earnings that they can never save for that deposit. That is now going to be rolled out to social housing providers, i.e. local council and housing associations, allegedly, so they can be freed up to build more affordable housing, which is all many of them build anyway. Very, very little social housing is built anymore, yet it is those living in the most stable and truly affordable social houses that are going to have to pay for this. So the optics are perverse, to say the least. Of the affordable housing put on the open market, most will get bought up as buy-to-lets. I appreciate Labour have ended no-fault evictions and the like to help renters, which is good. I cannot fault that. But when rents are going to be driven up from council and housing associations closer to those affordable levels, affordable housing levels, closer to those open market rents, and with their waiting lists, people are going to be less inclined to wait if there's little value in waiting. If the costs are not going to be dramatically different. A lot more people just have to end up accepting what might not be a too indifferent monthly rent. Those that can afford it anyway, or think they can. Others who might be on the waiting list might end up being confronted with rising rents for housing they've waited a long time to bid on, to apply for, only for it to turn out that it is no longer affordable to them. But therein lies another problem Reeves is creating here, isn't there, which I'll come on to in a moment. I certainly don't believe that Rachel Reeves wants people to be homeless. To drive that up, she just doesn't want to tax the rich. She enjoys punching down on people at the bottom of the income scale. There seems to be something about her that makes her want to blame them, appears to blame them for being there. Her husband, Nick Joycey, incidentally, was for years involved at the DWP. He worked there, and you can't help but wonder whether her desire to attack those on benefits particularly comes from that relationship in some way. But if you've lived on that system, then you know that's exactly what the DWP has done for years, does do, and you really can't help but wonder if there's some sort of a connection there. But for as much as Reeves might desire to punch down on those whose job doesn't pay enough, like they deserve it, or might be too disabled to work, whatever the reason might be that someone is in social housing, possibly by choice. Not everybody wants to actually own a home. Renting used to be a choice. It's quite a common thing in the continent. Their housing costs will have to rise with the rent. And that's bound to see a rise in the benefits bill, up to the point the benefit cap may kick in anyway, which of course has itself always been a postcode lottery. But this move will drive the benefit bill up to meet the cap in more places, driving more people into debt, and that would result in more homelessness. And I remind you that Reeves' justification for all of this is to build more affordable homes. How, if the benefit bill ends up being certain to rise as a result of higher housing costs, is this freeing up cash to build more housing? And in what way does the concept of the housing being affordable even apply? Well, whilst you might bemoan stories coming down the line of the benefits bill rising, though of course Reeves has plans to slash benefits yet as well. We don't know the details of that to any great degree yet. But this could end up, as a result of that, being a double-edged sword for those living in social housing. The higher rent is exactly what some councils and housing associations want to be able to build with their housing. With all that extra cash coming in, they might be able to do that. Not guaranteed, might. And with Labour's plans to relax planning rules to get houses built, it might deliver the buildings, but not necessarily people who can afford to live in them. And the other aspect of this is that in typical Rachel Reeves fashion, this isn't even a new idea. It's not even her idea. It's another one of George Osborne's. Does she actually have any ideas of her own? Or did he just give her his notes from his time in office? Because it really does make you wonder at this point. The fact is the Tories discovered they couldn't sustainably keep hiking social rents. And it's that rent increase versus housing benefit cost balance that made it so. David Cameron, during the coalition years, tried this. An annual rent settlement scheme, as it was called, was introduced in 2012, where rents would increase by the rate of the retail price index plus 0.5%. But by 2015, George Osborne was forced to row back on this. And for the next 4 years, rent increases rose by below the rate of inflation because the housing benefit bill had skyrocketed. The Tories decided to try again in 2020 because the pandemic presumably provided the perfect cover for them to try out repeating the mistake by doing the same thing over and over again and hoping it would work. But on this occasion, Bozo the Clown opened the country up too fast after the pandemic, which of course, as we all remember, led to inflation shooting up to 11%. So rent increases were capped again at below that rate, though still high, at 7%. So after the last 14 years, this has been tried twice now, and Rachel Reeves, so averse to tax changes that would make the wealthiest in society pay a tiny fraction more to pay for all of this, is going for third time's a charm on the Tory score and going harder than the Tories actually ever did. Taking what David Cameron did, a 10-year plan with rent increases equivalent to the consumer price index, but this time plus 1%. Taxing the rich would offset very cheap to borrow, around 1% at the moment as it happens, government spending to build housing instead, or inject that cash into local councils to build, or housing associations, given they are in the main non-profit organisations. It would free up a lot more money too, and go a lot further to deal with our housing crisis meaningfully, and to a greater degree, without inflicting more hardship on those with the least. For the temerity, for the nerve of wanting to live in state-owned, subsidised housing, renting your house, which matches people's incomes, those lucky enough to still live in a proper social house, because they are thin on the ground these days, as it is, has decided these people deserve to be punished instead. The Tories have already demonstrated this doesn't work. It is social and economic insanity to do this again, and the reputational damage to Labour will be off the charts. The party that is, after all, supposed to be on the side of ordinary working class people who live in these houses, the party of workers, of trade unions, and I hope many of these trade unions, especially if they're Labour affiliated, are spitting rivets at this. Any credible one worth its salt and led properly should be, has instead positioned itself on the side of the landlords and the rentier class, and whilst they claim more money will be freed up to build with the housing benefit and universal credit housing elements bound to increase, will that even be true? Because I doubt it. The party that rebuilt Britain, that did away with the slums and embarked on a major house-building campaign after World War II, when the public finances were so much worse, that created social housing, is now going to be the party that kills it off. This simply is not a Labour Party. They are not helping ordinary workers. They are not interested. They are not interested in helping those lowest paid in society. They've decided to punish them for being poor instead. And this is just one policy area. Reeves hates benefit claimants, many of whom will be in work, others who cannot possibly. And we've still to see what cuts she has got planned there, of course. Social media has, of course, had a say on all of this news that broke overnight, as you can imagine it would have done. James Nelson, for example, wrote, "Labour, we shall make housing more affordable by building more homes. Everyone. So how will you fund this?" Rachel Reeves, by making housing less affordable, of course. I wish I was making this up. And fundamentally, that is exactly what is happening here. Neil Schofield Hughes wrote, "The sheer, utter, abject stupidity of making a dire housing crisis worse in the short to medium term, and impoverishing further many who are already in dire need, in the vague aspiration of longer term building, all in the name of arbitrary fiscal rules. Utterly clueless." Completely right. I hadn't brought up the fiscal rules, but that is Rachel Reeves choosing to tie her own hands, isn't it? And not borrow to invest, leaving her to make stupid choices such as the one she is making here. If Labour want fiscal credibility, they'll be ditching her ASAP, but of course they won't, because Starmer is even more economically ignorant and needs her to hide behind. And Bill Cruikshank had one of the best sum-ups of this. So have I got this right? Reeves is planning to raise the rents of those already in social housing, who are already struggling to pay for more social housing. So she's going to tax the poor to help the poor. The UK is now a dystopian nightmare. Not social housing, Bill, affordable housing, but that isn't affordable either. For reference, and because I haven't mentioned the figures previously, affordable housing can be anything up to 90% of full market rate. So not much of a gap, not really affordable necessarily, as I alluded to several times earlier, and as I keep saying. But social housing is around 50% of market rate. So the damage being done to people who can afford that, but not significant hikes without either more housing benefit or equivalent or a significant wage rise, but that requires economic growth, and the only thing growing in this Labour government, sadly, is cruelty combined with idiocy. If only they could capitalise on that. This policy benefits absolutely nobody. It will cost more in housing benefits, so there is no saving. Tenants cannot save themselves as they'll pay more rent, so we'll never get on the housing ladder. Local economies will suffer due to people simply having less money to spend. So there goes Reeves' much vaunted economic growth for the nation. And while housing associations might laud this, local councils whose funding has been cut across a wide swathe of services will more likely use any cash raised to block more of its own funding gaps. Where millionaires and billionaires are right to be taxed, they're due on this vast amount of hoarded wealth they all have, and that would make a real meaningful difference in dealing with this housing crisis if they were. Instead, a small number of the worst off will be hammered for a tiny return, which won't put a dent in matters, by a truly nasty bunch of red Tories. Meanwhile, if you want to get into Rachel Reeves' head a bit more to try and understand why she's making such abjectly stupid policy decisions like this, which will no doubt serve to see Labour's approval ratings plummet harder and faster than ever, she does like to make reference to the national finances being just like a household budget, which clearly isn't true. The nation can print any money it needs. We, in our households, cannot do that at all. But a rather clever economist, tired of Reeves making this comparison, as well as plenty of other chancellors over the years doing the same, decided to conduct a thought experiment, supposing the national finances actually were like a household budget, and looked at what Reeves has planned. And he still discovered Reeves is failing in her policy choices on that measure as well. Get the details of how worried we should be that this person is in charge of the nation's purse strings in this video recommendation here. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.